Appreciate the opportunity to be here. It was a rather daunting task whenever Keith told me what he wanted me to talk about. I had to go through and look at, I think, 96 different cover crop species that he mentioned, and then I tried to think about every rotation between corn, soybeans, sunflowers, cotton, wheat, and then work out all the interactions between all of those. So we should be done sometime next week, if that's all right with y'all. If not, I might shorten it up just a little bit. So I'm just going to talk basically about herbicide considerations on what you need to think about for cover crops. Not anything that you're going to do really specific. There are such a wide range of potential options that it's really hard to address all of them. So the main things that we want to consider, one, of course, is what about carryover from our primary crop? Whatever herbicides we happen to use in our main cash crop or whatever, how will that affect what cover crop options that we've got? Then we've got weed management within our cover crop. Just because it's a cover, hopefully we could get by with not having any weed management issues, but in all likelihood, I like to treat things as a crop that I'm trying to grow. I'm farming that cover crop. I want it to be successful. So if there's weed management that I have to do within that cover crop, that's something that we need to consider. Then I got to usually may terminate that cover crop. What considerations do I have about how I'm going to kill that cover crop so that I can go back in and plant that cash crop at the right time? And then if anything that I use in that cover crop, I happen to use, might have carryover back to my primary cash crop, whatever's in that rotation, I want to be able to take that into consideration. I really appreciate a couple of speakers yesterday talking about planning on your herbicide rotations and what your crops need to be, where you're going to go for 3 to 5 years down the road, so you kind of know which direction that you're going to be going. So I think that's a really important thing. As a disclaimer, I am going to mention some different products out of specific labels. I am not recommending any of these things. I think anytime you're using a herbicide for any purpose, you need to look at what weeds you're trying to control, what crops why you're trying to control those weeds, and then what your next rotation is going to be. So these are just for example only. So first, let's look at carryover from your primary crop. This is a herbicide that is used that has residual activity potentially on your cover crop or crops. You'll notice a theme all the way through this. The primary source of information on what that might be able to be used for, or what you're going to have herbicide carryover issues, is going to come out of that herbicide label. Almost every herbicide label is going to have a rotational crops with, it may have rates, it may have months, depending on what rate, and then a list of crops that is legal to rotate to. And what chemical companies have done is they've gone out and they've done testing to see how long their herbicides last in the soil and how long is a safe time to come back and plant those different crops. If the cover crops that you're trying to grow happen to be listed within that rotational list that's going to be included in the label, you're free and clear. That's the easy way to go, because you're able to just pick off of that and then follow whatever recommendations are on that label. But there's such a wide range of different cover crops planted, odds are it's not going to be on that list. So one of the things that I do after that is you'd look at this list and try and pick out a crop, whatever, if there's something fairly similar in the same family or even genus as the cover crops that you're trying to plant. You're kind of on your own at this point in time, because if it's if the crops that you're planting are not specifically listed, then you don't have any label protection. If the herbicide does happen to kill that cover crop and causes you to have a failure, you have no protection if your cover crop is not specifically listed. The other thing to do if your cover crop is not listed as the rotational crop is look at the weeds that it says that that herbicide will control. Every herbicide pretty much should have a list of weeds that it's going to control, what they recommend, usually what rate is going to be. You want to look at ones that are going to get pre-emergence or residual control of. If it's strictly post-control, then it probably wouldn't be an issue. But if your cover crop is fairly similar to the crops that are listed on the herbicide label, then you can kind of count on, you may have some issues with it. For instance, on this label, if you look over here, wherever, the brassica species, obviously, if this has got pre-emerge activity on the brassicas, there's a pretty good shot that if you were to go in and use, mustards or whatnot inside your, as your cover crop, you would have a greater risk of failure. Next, we want to look at, consider weed management in what you're inside your cover crop. If you have to manage weeds, if there's something that you need to do. For a simple crop, or for a single crop, if you're only using one and you're not using a diverse mix, it's a relatively easy approach to it. You just look on the herbicide label. If your cover crop is listed, obviously, you're going to be okay on that. You just use it and follow the label instructions. If you're using a multi-species, as we hear a lot about, then things get really challenging, particularly when you throw in legumes and things like that. It's hard to find a herbicide that's going to be labeled for everything that you might consider putting in a legume. One of those 25 species blends would scare me to death trying to come up with a good herbicide program to try and use within that. What you'll want to do then is look, obviously if in the multi-species, if they're all listed on that herbicide label, then you just got to be able to follow the instructions, for each one of those. But you have to follow the instructions for each one of the crops included. One of the things to be considered is, different species have different tolerance levels. So there's the potential that you would be able to, have to use a different rate for one as there would to another. If you follow, those label restrictions, for all of the crops, you should be all right. Again, we get into if it's not on that herbicide list. I apologize, I've actually got the wrong table on this one. There's a table of weeds controlled list that should have gone on this slide. If your cover crop, again, is similar to one of the things that is listed on the weeds controlled, then there's a pretty good shot that you would have problems with planting a similar species. Likewise, if there's similar crops to what that cover crop is, you may be able to get by with that. Like I said, the weeds controlled, if you look at that list, if your cover crop is included or something similar to that, you've got a good chance of problems and a failure. One of the big things to consider is grazing restrictions with these cover crops. If your cover crop is not on that label listed and with a grazing tolerance provided, then you cannot legally graze that cover crop. That means that there is no tolerance set with the US EPA that handles or regulates herbicides, or all pesticides for that matter. Now, the grazing restrictions that you're going to see, they're going to look something like this. Ideally in the perfect world it would be, I got no grazing restriction. I can go out there and spray and be able to go right back into that field without a problem. More likely, most things that you're going to see are going to have a certain days after application. Of course, this works the same thing for any type of crop that you might be grazing. You need to follow this. This allows enough of that herbicide to break down within the plant so that you don't have any potential tolerance issues. Another thing would be there's also often grazing restrictions based on whether animals are lactating or not. Even withdrawal periods, if they're going to slaughter, you need to be able to watch those grazing restrictions for whatever you do. And then a lot of things that may or may not be labeled, that you might want to use in a cover crop. If it's a green manure crop, you can get away with it. But a lot of these, if the chemical company has not spent the money to develop that grazing restriction or grazing tolerance, then you won't be able to, then they would not have put it on the label. Doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means the chemical company didn't want to spend the millions and millions of dollars it takes to put that little sentence on the label. So if that's the case, then no grazing would be allowed, period. The next deal is that we talk about is termination of your cover crop. It typically, as glyphosate or Roundup has gotten so much cheaper, back when it was, I can remember paying $90 a gallon for it. We didn't use it nearly as freely as we do now when I can go out there and I can spray a quart for about $4. So it's something that we've gotten so used to using glyphosate, we created ourselves a lot of problems. And particularly when we're looking at diverse cover crops, where you've got broadleafs and grasses all mixed together that we may want to terminate, using something that's a broad spectrum herbicide is something that we'd be really interested in or like to do, especially if it's as cheap as glyphosate is. But the problem that we see right here, all of the use that we've had in very, particularly with Roundup Ready crops and the reduction in price of glyphosate, we've overused glyphosate in a pretty bad way. What we've done is we've gone out there and we've selected for glyphosate-resistant ecotypes within different species. Mare's tail is probably, in this picture, is probably one of the most common. It was one of the early ones, but glyphosate is now, we've selected for resistant populations, I think in like 68 different weed species was the last count that I heard. And once you have glyphosate resistance, that's a dominant trait. So you will basically always have glyphosate resistance within that population. So what we want to do is we want to try and look at some other things as a resistance management tool. The Weed Science Society of America has basically divided all of our herbicide families into different site of action classification numbers. And the only way that we're really going to prevent herbicide resistance from beginning or really getting out of hand is if we do something to remove that constant selection pressure off of one of these site of actions. Roundup, if you look on it, that's the glyphosate is the active ingredient. It's a group 9. So that's the mode of action on it. If you change from one glyphosate to another glyphosate, you're not doing anything different. Or if you were to change to something else that had a group 9, if there was another one out there, glyphosate's really the only one in that site of action family. That doesn't do anything, changing brand names and whatnot doesn't do anything to limit or reduce development of herbicide resistance. If we're trying to go with broad spectrum, if you're wanting to use a single control method for a wide range of broadleafs and grasses and whatnot, then we need to go with one of the other broad spectrum or non-selective type herbicides. One of them is glufosinate, active ingredient in Liberty. If you notice, it's a group 10, so it's a different site of action within that plant. Now there are Liberty Link or glufosinate tolerant crop plants that are out there now. So we're trying to not make the same mistakes with glufosinate that we did with glyphosate. They sound pretty close alike, but they are different crops or different herbicides. But there's a lot of effort that's going into trying to make sure that we can reduce or delay or hopefully avoid building up the weed resistance with glufosinate. Another one that we've got is gramoxone or paraquat. Cyclone, it's been around for a very long time. It's an outstanding non-selective contact herbicide. Good coverage is really important. It needs a sticker or something in order to get it through that leaf area, but it'll burn down stuff in a matter of days. One thing about gramoxone or paraquat, if you use it, It is the one herbicide that I know of that's still on the market today that is extremely toxic. One drop on your tongue ingested is enough to kill any person in here. It's the only herbicide that I know that can do this, that's being sold in the United States. As long as you use it according to label, it's very safe. I've sprayed lots and lots of it over the years back in my cotton growing days. As long as you respect it and use it correctly, it's a perfectly safe product. The issues that they've run into it in the last several years is a lot of people have made the tragic error of transferring Gramoxone from one bottle into another one, particularly Coke bottles, and then some child will come along and decide they want to take a sip of that Coke. And one sip, and at last count there have been 18 deaths that I know of, and every one of them occurred because of that. So if you use Gramoxone, I don't scare people away from it, but it's a great product, great herbicide. Use this one with great respect. Other ones, you're pretty safe on all of them. The next thing to kind of look at is our carryover to a primary crop. If we did use a herbicide for some sort of weed control within our cover crops, or to terminate those cover crops if you happen to use something other than one of those non-selectives that did have residual, we'll make sure that's not going to carry over back to your primary crop. Again, same thing. The herbicide label is our friend. It's got the information that we're going to need to have on it. You will want to make sure, for certain that your primary crop that you're planting back to is listed within that rotation. That's for two purposes. One is product safety, going back to that crop, so you're not going to damage your stand on your primary crop. Nobody wants to hurt their yields on their main cash crop. The other thing is some herbicides can again have a soil residual carryover that can be picked up that might result in illegal residues in the following primary crop. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, whatever herbicides you use, whatever is in that rotation that you've planned out years in advance, that you've got that covered. If the primary crop is not listed as a rotational crop, then you're kind of you're at somewhat of a risk. One, if there did happen to ever come up with something where there were illegal residues left over from that previous crop or from the cover crop herbicide, then you might be at risk of that. But the primary risk is if your primary crop is not listed as a rotational crop, is the risk that that residual is going to cause either stand damage or yield reduction in your primary cash crop. So if you can hopefully stay with something that's listed on the rotationals, then you're in good shape. Again, that's probably the main thing. If you don't know anything, or if you're unsure of, or want to be as sure as you can be, the next step is probably to go with a bioassay of your field. There's a number of different ways to do that. A lot of herbicide labels will actually have a instruction on how to conduct the bioassay. They're usually doing it out in the fields where your crop is actually growing. I'm not a big fan of that because typically if I'm going back with my primary crop that I want to see whether it works, I need to know that before earlier than it takes if I'm going to try and plant that crop actually in the field. Sometimes you can go with a more sensitive crop that may pick that up. But if you do the field bioassay, it's the most accurate. You can plant strips across that field of something more very similar or whatever your primary crop is going to be. If it comes up and it grows fine, then you know for certain you're in good shape. What I've tended to use more often has been a container bioassay, where I'll actually go in and collect soil from multiple areas within the field that's been treated, as well as collect soil that has not been treated and then plant something inside where I can control the environment and I know whether it's typically you'll take like the top 2 inches of soil, put it in one of these containers, plant it to a sensitive seed, put it on your windowsill or whatnot. That way you can find out without having to wait until the weather is appropriate for actually going back to test with your primary crop. There's a number of different publications out there on how to do a bioassay. I really like this one from Nebraska. There's the link to it, or you can just search bioassay neb guide, and they'll come up with that. It's a very good source. One of the things that I can't stress enough is always read and follow those label directions. Herbicide labels, in fact, all pesticide labels, are governed by the U.S. EPA, and they carry with them the authority of law. Violation of any aspect on a pesticide label is a violation of federal law. Now, you're not likely to get thrown in jail, probably not, but you're not likely to go to jail or anything like that. The risk of violating the label beyond potential damage to your own crops is the risk of having your crops actually condemned. I know that's happened more than once in Texas. In particular, there's a herbicide called MSMA, which is an old herbicide, but it's one that the Texas Department of Ag really takes a big interest in. MSMA has arsenic in it. The people have used it in lawns, and it was used in cotton fields for years and whatnot. It controls sandburrs really well. So a lot of horse hay people want to use that. I have seen horse hay loads get tested and condemned, which means the Department of Ag says that that's no longer saleable and now has to be disposed of as toxic waste. So it's a really expensive disposal. You lose your crop, it can be a really bad thing. So I can't stress enough that to read and follow that label. It's going to help you with your herbicide management with cover crops or anything else. So the summary of what I've got to say, if y'all don't mind, I'm going to finish early. Try to make up the keek yesterday. The herbicide label is going to be the primary source of information on both the spectrum of activity and what its carryover potentials are. I know lots of people don't like to read them. They've got lots of stuff and legalese sounding words in them and small print, but this is our #1 source of information, not just for cover crops or whatnot. You need to do this for any pesticide that you're going to apply to make sure that you use it both safely and effectively. The bioassay, if you've got any questions and you want to make for sure, the bioassay is your best estimate for site-specific estimates of carryover risk. There's really not a better way that you can know for sure, because even though something may be listed on those rotational labels and whatnot, labels are meant to cover a wide range, and both plants and herbicides don't always read the book to know what they're supposed to do. Bioassay will tell you pretty much for sure. Remember to consider your resistance management. And that's not just within cover crops or whatnot. That's within any herbicide. Our herbicides are a tool. I'm a spray guy. I like to spray weeds. I freely admit that. Jeff Goodwin harasses me about it on a regular basis. But it's, as much as I like to spray weeds, a lot of times I want to make sure that I use my herbicides in the manner that they need to be used. Utilize your integrated pest management principles. Spray according to economic thresholds, preventive measures. Use your herbicides well and rotate modes of action whenever you can. The important thing is, by rotating those modes of action and whatnot, what we do is we maintain that tool in our toolbox. Sometimes we may spend more money in one year than we would necessarily like, but I can guarantee you the guys that are now running up $100 hoe bills and trying to control glyphosate-resistant Palmer amaranth wish that years ago they would have decided to rotate their modes of action and been able to maintain glyphosate as an effective material on that particular